you to know how blessed you are to be here at First Assembly Fort Myers and with Pastor Dan Betzer. And it's just a tremendous honor for me to be at this Sunday school class today. I just got done speaking for a week in Colorado Springs. There's a Charis Bible College that Andrew Womack has out there. So I spoke, and I'm going to sort of pick up with my slide presentation so I'm going to go through a bunch of slides that I'm not going to talk about to get to the ones that I want to talk about today. I talk about Islam conquering all the Middle East that used to be Christian, and Egypt was Christian for 6 centuries, evangelized by Mark that wrote the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Syria was Christian for 6 centuries, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. The name Christian was first used in Syria. There used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa, and they were all wiped out by the Umayyad Muslims. Then they invaded Spain, and they're stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours. And then the Turks convert to Islam, and they conquer into what is today Turkey. Back then it was the Byzantine Christian Empire. And so when the Muslims conquer Constantinople, it cuts off the land routes to India. And that's when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route. So Columbus would have never set sail had it not been for Islamic jihad conquering Constantinople, cutting off the land routes. Anyway, the Muslim leader in the 1500s is Sultan Suleiman, and Martin Luther is the beginner of the Reformation. And so Martin Luther says, the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. If the Turk's God, the devil, is not beaten first, there is reason to fear. The Turk will not be so easy to beat. Anyway, so the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor is Charles V of Spain. He is the defender of Christendom, and he controls Spain, Spanish Netherlands, Italy, all the New World. The Philippines are named after his son, King Philip of Spain. And so the two most powerful kings in the world, he's faced with a double dilemma. Protestant Reformation on one hand, Muslim invasion on the other hand. And so he sort of has problems on the inside and the outside. And so Charles V of Spain does a deal with the Protestants. It's called the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. It's the first treaty ever to recognize Protestants. And the year in German, I speak a little bit of German, but 1555 is 1555. But in this treaty is a little Latin phrase, cuius regio ius religio, which means whose is the reign, his is the religion. So for the first time ever, Protestants got to be recognized. The attitude was that we may not always agree on religion, but let's work together against this Islamic invasion. So Europe is thrown into this confusion of mass migration of people shifting from one kingdom to another, right? Because every king got to decide what's going to be believed in his kingdom because of this Peace of Augsburg. But different kings believe different things. And so you have Italy, Spain, France, Austria, Poland stay Catholic. Northern Germany and Sweden are Lutheran. Switzerland, Calvinist. England, Anglican. Bohemian, Moravian, Hussites there in sort of the Czech, Eastern Germany area. Anabaptists and so forth. But it was one Christian denomination per country. And if you didn't believe the way your particular king did, you were persecuted and you fled. And so this is sort of the backdrop of why the Pilgrims came to America. And so Henry VIII is the King of England. Now are you still following me? By the way, all this information is in the book called The Treacherous World of the 16th Century and How the Pilgrims Escaped It, sort of the background of the 1500s. Just finished that book. And then the one I did previous is Who is the King in America? And as Dr. Joe was saying, I go through an overview of 6,000 years of world history, and the most common form of government's a king. Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar. From Nimrod, Tower of Babel, they keep getting bigger because with military advancements, you can kill more people. Iron stronger than bronze, gunpowder, stirrups, scimitar, swords, and so forth. But it's still that fallen nature of Cain, kill, and Abel. Right? You put some kids in a playground, one's the bully hogging the ball. Put some junior high girls in a clique, one of them's the diva. Put some people in the woods, one of them's the Indian chief. Put them in the inner city, one of them's the gang leader. And all a king is a glorified gang leader, right? It's a hierarchical system. If you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. So it's this pyramid structure to society that keeps repeating itself around the world. And clearly it's going to have its ultimate manifestation as the Antichrist in the book of Revelation. And then God comes down and smashes it, and then he sets up his kingdom. But that's what this book's about. And so in America, the people are the king. And then we get to voluntarily submit ourselves to the King of Kings. Right? Psalm says, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. So it's not a king who rules through fear, shoving the kingdom of God from the top down. It's the people from the bottom up. That's the concept that the Pilgrims understood. And then I have a set of DVDs called Miracles in American History, times in our country's past, where there's a crisis, they pray, and things turn around. My wife says those are the best stories, because they pray and things turn around. So we were talking about Islam invading Europe. The Reformation starts 1517, and then Germany breaks away. But then England decides to break away from Rome. Henry VIII. But he does not have a spiritual experience. He just wants another wife. And he ends up having 6 wives, right? The first one, Catherine of Aragon, is the daughter of the King of Spain, and she does not have a son. A daughter, Mary, but not a son. So Henry decides to divorce her, and the Pope won't recognize the divorce because the King of Spain's army invaded Rome and imprisoned the Pope for 6 months in 1527. So the Pope's not in any hurry to get on the wrong side of the King of Spain. So the Pope says no to Henry's divorce. And so Henry says, I'm just going to make myself my own Pope. He starts the Church of England, puts himself on as the head, goes on to have 6 wives, right? And their fates were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So so Henry VIII was not a really nice guy to be married to. So you got the Catholic Church, and then Henry breaks away, and then he starts the Anglicans, and then there's the Puritans that are trying to purify the Anglican Church, but the king doesn't think he needs any purifying, so he persecutes them. There's another group that said it's beyond hope of trying to purify the Anglican Church. We are going to separate ourselves. They call themselves separatists. We call them pilgrims. Anyway, so here's Henry VIII and all of his wives, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anna Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. And anyway, Henry's advisors suggest to him that if he's really serious about breaking from Rome, he needs to stop using that old Latin Bible. As long as you're speaking Latin, people are going to look toward Italy, they're going to look toward Rome. You need to get yourself an English Bible. The German princes have Martin Luther's German Bible. That helped them to break away from Rome. You need an English Bible. It just so happens a couple years earlier, Henry VIII had William Tyndale burnt at the stake for translating the Bible into English. And now it's a couple years later, his advisors tell him he needs an English Bible. And so they basically take Tyndale's work and polish it up, and they call it the Great Bible. Now, William Tyndale's last words before he got killed was, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And so now it's a couple years later, and he decides, hey, I need an English Bible. And they take Tyndale's Bible. And now Henry VIII likes it. See, here's the cover page of it. And see him, he's on his throne, passing the Bible to the clergy and laity. And so he orders a copy of this put in every church in England. It's the first time ever that the common people in England get to have access to reading the Bible in their own language. And Henry dusts his hands and says, well, that's it. We broke from Rome. But something unexpected happened. People began to read it now that it's in their language. And they began to compare what's in this Bible to this king divorcing and beheading his wives and claiming to be the head of Christ's church. And so a group started that wanted to purify the church called Puritans, and then the separatists. Now, the kings thought they were God's special lieutenant, so to speak. And so it's the creator gives all the power to the king, and he dispenses it to the people, and called the divine right of kings. So kings did not believe everyone was created equal. They believed they were created a little extra special. They didn't believe the creator gave all the rights to individuals. No, the creator gave all the rights to him, and he dispenses it to whoever he thought. And so, again, friends with the king, more equal, not friends with the king, less equal, enemy of the king, you're dead. Pyramid structure to society. So here's King James. He says, kings are God's lieutenants upon earth, sit upon God's throne. The king is the overlord of the whole land, master over every person, having power over the life and death of everyone. So there's two parts to the Bible, and I get into it in this book. The first, obviously Old New Testament, but there's two parts to the government in ancient Israel. The first 400 years out of Egypt, Israel has no king. They're ruled by the law. The law says there's no respect of persons in judgment. Rich or poor, everyone's the same. It's the beginning of the concept of equality. This period is referred to as the Hebrew Republic. And that's the period that the Puritans and America's founders look back to. But then after they get King Saul, it becomes a monarchy in Israel, and King James looked back to the monarchy. And he would use all those scriptures saying, hey, you got this divinely appointed king like King David, and so he wanted to choose that part, but the Puritans wanted to go back to that first 400 years of the Hebrew Republic. So they both had scriptural basis for their positions, but obviously the Puritans influenced the Pilgrims, influenced the founding of America, and we say, no, we want to go back to that original plan that God gave Israel before they, sinned. And so King Henry's attitude was, yes, you can read the Bible in your own language, but no, you can't believe whatever you want. You got to believe what I tell you to believe. I'm the intermediary between heaven and the people. So he passed the Act of Uniformity in Prayer that basically says if you have 5 people meeting in your home and you are talking religion without approval of the government, you are all criminals. They'll bust into the house and arrest everybody. They passed a 5-mile act. If you are caught preaching within 5 miles of a town without approval of the government, you are a criminal, and they'll drag you before the Star Chamber and twist your arm and brand you on the face as a heretic. So the king's the head of the church. The Puritans want to purify it. I talked about this. So the Muslims are invading Greece. Greek scholars are fleeing to Italy with their Greek New Testaments. And so the European scholars are seeing stuff in the Greek that they hadn't seen before because they were just going back to Latin. And so in Greek, there's a word called ecclesia. And ek means out of, ecclesia means a calling. It's a Greek word where the Greeks in Athens would call people out of their homes to the public assembly to deliberate on what's going to happen. And so that's the word that Jesus, used, that they translated it, upon this rock I'll build my church. Ecclesia, a calling out of the people. It refers to ancient Israel, where they were a body of the people. And in William Tyndale's Bible, the word ecclesia was translated congregation or assembly. And King James didn't like the word ecclesia being translated congregation or assembly. And so in his translation of the Bible, he insisted that the word ecclesia be translated church. Why? Because he wanted to be the head of it. And how can you be the head of something that's a body, a bottom-up form of government? Do you see that? Anyway, I can get into that more later, but so here's King James, Anglicans, and then the Puritans, and then the Separatists or the Pilgrims. And the Separatists would be dragged before the Star Chamber, and they would be tortured and put in the pillory. And so this was the situation when the Pilgrim Separatists decided they wanted to flee. This was one of the Baptist founders of England, one of the founders of the Baptist faith in England. And he said, the king is a mortal man and not God, therefore he hath no power over the mortal soul of his subjects to make laws and ordinances for them, to set up spiritual lords over them. If the king's people obey all humane laws made by the king, our Lord the king can require no more. For men's religion is betwixt God and themselves. The king shall not answer for it, neither may the king be a judge between God and man. So the king didn't like these people saying this. Now, a later Baptist in America named Leland, he said, every man must give an account of himself to God, and therefore every man ought to be at liberty to serve God in a way that he can best reconcile to his conscience. If government can answer for individuals at the day of judgment, let men be controlled by it in religious matters. Otherwise, let men be free. So it's this attitude, if the king will stand there on the day of judgment and answer for your conscience, fine, believe whatever the king tells you. But if the king's not going to be there on the day of judgment, you are accountable to God for your own conscience. So this was the idea that these Protestant reformers had, and obviously the king didn't like that because he wanted to be the intermediary. And so Jefferson writes to Baptists, right? The famous, he says, gentlemen, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God. And then that's where Jefferson's letter goes on to say separation of church and state. So, are you still with me? I'm trying to paint a picture of what's going on in Europe. Meanwhile, there is the Battle of Lepanto, 1571. Biggest battle ever on the Mediterranean. You have 230 Muslim ships powered by 15,000 Christian slaves under the deck rowing. The Christian slaves are rowing the Muslim ships that are attacking the Christians. And Don John of Austria is the son of King Charles V of Spain. Remember, Martin Luther has to stand trial before Charles V. Charles V then has a son, and his name is Don John of Austria. He leads the Holy League. He's 24 years old. This is the last-ditch effort to save Europe from the Muslim invasion. But he's really courageous. He's fought in a bunch of battles ever since he was a kid. And the wind is against the Holy League. And so the admirals go to this young Don John and say, look, we can always fight another day because we're here to fight. He gets them on deck. They pray. While they're praying, the wind changes 180 degrees. And the Muslim sails all go limp. The Holy League sails all fill up, and they smash, and they capture or sink 200 of the 230 Muslim ships. It saves Europe. Anyway, but unfortunately, instead of using this victory and going around the Mediterranean and freeing all of it from Muslim control, Spain decides to send its military to smash the Reformation in Holland and in England. And so in Holland, they commit the Spanish Furies. Antwerp, Holland, I mean, the Spanish just butcher lots and lots of people. And then they send their armada to England. Now, William of Orange, it was the Seven United Netherlands. So Holland has three names. It's called Holland, the Dutch, and the Netherlands. A little confusing. But it's 7 provinces, and they all unite together against Spain. It was an 80-year war of independence for Holland to break away from Spain. And so as they are driving the Muslims back, this Prince William of Orange frees a city called Leiden and starts a university there. And the people of Leiden have an annual day of thanksgiving to thank God for driving the Spanish out. So I want to put that on a shelf in the back of your mind. I'll come back to it. And then another thought is the Jews were in little communities all around Europe. But when the Spanish, under Ferdinand and Isabella, drive the Muslims out of Spain, then they decide to drive the Jews out, unfortunately. So some of the Jews flee to Portugal, and then from Portugal they flee to Holland. And where did the Jews settle in Holland? In Leiden, Holland. And then I'll come back to that. The Jews had a professor that taught at the University of Leiden. And he taught, Aramaic and Hebrew and Syriac and then what? The Jews had their feasts, and at the end of the year was Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Tabernacles. So now we got 2 different Thanksgiving feasts at the end of the year. One was to celebrate the driving out of the Spaniards, and the other is the Jewish feast of Rosh Hashanah. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So the Spanish, after defeating the Muslims at the Battle of Lepanto, they tried to smash the Reformation in Holland and then in England. And so they send this armada. Here's Philip II of Spain. He's the son of Charles V, the legitimate son, right? So Don John of Austria that fought at the Battle of Lepanto, he was sort of an illegitimate son. So, but Philip is the legitimate son. Anyway, so he sends his armada to England. And the Queen of England is Elizabeth. And she gives the most famous speech of her career. She puts on a coat of armor and she comes out and she says, I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the stomach of a king and of a king of England too. And I stand against any monarch of Europe that would dare invade the borders of my realm. And with God's help, we'll have a great victory. And so she stirs up the English. The English don't have a navy. It's just a bunch of privateers, right? Sir Francis Drake and a bunch of guys. And so here comes this Spanish armada coming toward England. And so the Francis Drake lights a ship on fire and floats it into where the Spanish are anchored. And then the Dutch have these flyboats, which have low keels, so they can go really fast. And they would shoot a couple shots at the Spanish, and then the Spanish would chase them and get stuck on a sandbar because the flyboats were shallow, and they knew the coast really well. And the Spanish ship would come and get stuck, and then they would capture. Anyway, but then a hurricane comes. It's always helpful to have a hurricane on your side. And so this hurricane smashes the Spanish armada to pieces, and only a couple of them make it their way back to Spain. And Philip II is like, he said, I sent my navy to fight England, not God's winds and waves. And so this is the top part is Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, and he writes this in 1776. He says, Spaniards claimed all America as their own, but the defeat of their invincible armada put it out of their power to obstruct any longer the settlements of other European nations. In the course of the 17th century, English, French, Dutch, Danes, and Swedes attempted to make some settlements in the New World. So it was sort of like an Oklahoma land rush, right? Before it was hands off the New World. Now it's okay. So France hurries up and settles New France, which becomes Canada. The Dutch settled New Amsterdam, which becomes New York. The Swedes settled New Sweden, which becomes Delaware and New Jersey. Nova Scotia means New Scotland. And the English settled New England and Virginia, named after the Virgin Queen. And so it's all like, let's hurry up and do this. And so a little afterthought, had the Spanish Armada won, there would have been no Anglicans in England. There would have been no Puritans trying to purify the Anglicans or Pilgrims. There would have been no New England colonies, no United States. North America would have been an extension of New Spain or Mexico. So it was a pretty important battle. So there's Queen Elizabeth, there's Sir Francis Drake, and then so they settle, or Sir Walter Raleigh, they settled Jamestown, 1607. And a little trivia, I wrote a book on the history of Islam. Captain John Smith, that helped found Jamestown, he spent 5 years fighting the Muslims in Hungary before he founded Jamestown. Right, he was 20 years old, goes to the army there in Hungary, and he's really courageous. He even, in hand-to-hand, one-on-one combat, he defeats 3 Muslims. And so here he is with the cross, and there's the crescent. And so he gets a coat of arms with 3 Muslim heads chopped off. Anyway, John Smith, a real fascinating story. But then he makes his way back to England, and then he set sail to settle Jamestown. So it was a king-run colony. There were 3 types of colonies. Company colonies, royal crown colonies, and proprietary colonies. What's the difference? Company colonies. Did you know that during the Middle Ages there were no companies? It was a sin to pay or receive interest, called usury. And so if you wanted to do some big endeavor like sail around the world looking for spices, you had to hit up some rich guy or a king. But once the Reformation happened, Holland had what was more or less the first company, and the Dutch East India Company. So anybody, blacksmith, cook, baker, could invest money in a boat going to Indonesia. When it came back filled full of spices, you would get paid a profit. And if you wanted to sell your interest, you would go down to the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. And of course, the Dutch settled New Amsterdam, and they would trade their stock exchange along the wall of the little fort. And when the British took over New Amsterdam, turned it into New York, it turned into Wall Street and the New York Stock Exchange, where people could pool their money to do big endeavors. Now, what if your boat sank? That's when the Dutch invented insurance companies. Right? All this came from the Dutch. So the British started a British East India Company and then started a Virginia Company. And the Virginia Company went bankrupt. Right? They had malaria, diseases, Indian attacks. One year they had 500 people in the fall and 50 survived by the spring. And so it was almost a good thing that the Pilgrims didn't make it there. But the Pilgrims were intending to, now the third type of colony, so you have company colony, royal crown proprietary colony, where the king sends over a governor, and then a proprietary colony where the king gives the whole thing as property to a friend. So William Penn got all of Pennsylvania as his personal property. So, but the king's in charge of all 3. And so Jamestown, the king controlled the government. The Pilgrims were going to go there. Now, again, the Pilgrims were separatists. They were the ones that were getting persecuted in England, and then after a while they fled to Holland. And now in Virginia, the charter says, in propagating the Christian religion to such people yet live in darkness. One of the other boats that came to Virginia got shipwrecked on Bermuda. And William Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, writes about this. And they meet some of the natives and so forth. But after being on Bermuda for a while, they piece together their boat, and they sail, and they actually make it to Jamestown. One of the guys on this boat was named John Rolfe, and while he was on Bermuda, he noticed a plant, sweet tobacco, and he brought that to Virginia and planted it. And for whatever reason, they thought tobacco was healthy because the Indians were really healthy, and they smoked peace pipes. And so they thought, Indians are healthy, they smoke tobacco. And so this became a craze in England. Everybody wanted to smoke. Doctors would even prescribe it. I think you need to smoke some tobacco. Yeah. Chocolate came from the Yucatan. And so earlier during the Spanish era. And so they thought that was like a healthy drink. It's like, you have to have my cup of chocolate. And so they planted all this tobacco in Jamestown. And I saw this. I'm reading through all the old documents. It says, Virginia Assembly 1624, whosoever shall absent himself from divine service any Sunday without an allowable excuse shall forfeit a pound of tobacco. We missed you at church on Sunday. Tobacco. And so, but you had to be an Anglican. So here's 1624, there shall be a uniformity in our church as near as may be to the canons in England. What does that mean? You have to be an Anglican to be in Virginia. In 1609, they passed, we should be loath that any person should be permitted to pass that we suspected to be affected of the superstitions of the Church of Rome. So there were no Catholics in Virginia. The first Catholic church in Virginia was First Catholic Church, right, in Virginia. 1795. 1795. That's well after the Constitution and everything. Anyway. So it says, none shall be permitted to pass in any voyage into the said country, but such as shall first take the Oath of Supremacy. So you couldn't even come to Virginia unless you took the Oath of Supremacy. What's that? I declare that the King's Highness is the only supreme governor of this realm in all things spiritual or ecclesiastical things. So you had to acknowledge the king is the head of the church, even to be allowed to come to Virginia. So it was an Anglican colony. And not to take the oath was considered treason. And so the Pilgrims, they're in Holland now, and they were in England. A couple stories. The king was persecuting them, and so some of them decided to sell their land and buy passage on a boat and go to Holland. 7 united Netherlands, they believed different things, so they sort of had a little give and take, but they united together against Spain. So Holland was like the most tolerant country on the planet. And they were the richest country. They had an island off the coast of Japan. They had all of Indonesia, Jakarta. They captured Goa, India from the Portuguese. They had South Africa, Recife, South America, and New Amsterdam, right? This big, so the Dutch were powerful. So the Pilgrims decided to go to Holland, and one group of them sell their property, go down and buy passage, but right before the ship takes off, the captain robs them and turns them over to the police, and they're thrown in jail. Oh, great, thanks. Well, another group of pilgrims decided to sell their property, but instead of going down to the port, they arranged for the Dutch ship to pick them up off the coast, and they would just get in little dinghy boats and row out to them. The Pilgrims show up a day early, and they're waiting, and the waves and the boats and everything, and the kids are getting sick, and so the wives say, can we just wait on shore, and so they put the women and children. Then the ship shows up, and the men row out, and they're storing everything on the boats, but somebody snitched. The British come over the hill and capture the women and children, and the Dutch captain says, I can't fight the British military, and he pulls anchor and sails away with the men. Can you imagine those wives saying, a husband? For 2 years, they passed those women and children from one court in England to another. Finally, a judge says, you didn't do anything wrong, go home. They go, duh, we sold our homes. And then just to get them out of their hair, they put them on a ship and send them over to Holland. And so they get reunited with their husbands, so there's a happy ending to that chapter. And so where do they settle in Holland? They settle in Leiden, Holland. And now who else is in Leiden? The Jews, right? And so while they're in Leiden, they get exposed to the Jews. And the elder William Brewster is teaching English in Holland. And there's these rabbis teaching Hebrew. And so they're rubbing shoulders with each other. And so the Hebrews, the Jews, would talk about leaving the Pharaoh. And these pilgrims would say, well, we left the King of England. And the Jews crossed the Red Sea, and they crossed the English Channel, and they came into their promised land. And so the Jews began to identify with that. Matter of fact, when the pilgrims began to identify with the Jews. So when they settled in New England, Harvard and Yale have Hebrew classes. And they actually have every single student learn to write Hebrew. Imagine that. They would give their commencement addresses in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. I mean, they had to be really smart. The pilgrims, they decide, with Holland being threatened to be attacked by Spain, that they were going to flee again. First, they thought of going to Guyana in South America. Wouldn't that have made history different? But because they heard of the perpetual spring and how nice it is, but then they heard about malaria, hurricanes, and the Spanish, who would wipe out other settlements. Do you know the first settlement in North America was in Jacksonville, Florida? It's called Fort Caroline. The French Protestants, called Huguenots, in the year 1565. But the Spanish find out about it and butcher all the men and take the women and children away. So the other countries of Europe said, stay away from Spain. So the pilgrim says, well, we don't want to go down to Guyana. Let's go to Jamestown. Yes, it's an Anglican colony, but we'll be so far away, the king won't notice what we're doing. So they're going to go to Jamestown. But their boat leaks. They got to take it back and get it recaulked. It happens twice. 102 of them confined to this 4-foot-high space for 66 days. It's not a cruise ship, right? It's tossing back and forth. I mean, there's no privacy. It's like really. And one young pilgrim guy, John Howland, goes topside just as a freezing wave swept the deck, knocked him overboard. If it wasn't for a rope that was dangling, they pull him in. And anyway. So the pilgrims finally get to the New World, and they find out that they are 500 miles away from Jamestown. And you think, no big deal, just sail down. No, it's wintertime, it's stormy, it's dangerous. And the pilgrims almost sink on an area off the coast of Cape Cod. So you see that white area, that's sand. And so if you've been to the beach, like here, where you can walk out, a quarter mile, and it's only up to your waist. And so off of Cape Cod, you could be like a mile away from the shore. And it'll only be like 10, 12 feet deep. And so this boat's just cruising along and gets stuck on a sandbar. Did you know over 3,000 boats have sunk off the coast of Cape Cod? It's called the graveyard of ships. So the pilgrims almost sink. The captain says, it is too dangerous. He goes back to Plymouth Rock, and he says, everybody off the boat. And they say, we have a question. Who's going to be in charge of us? There's no king-appointed person on our boat. The whole world's ruled by kings. The King of England is like one of the most powerful kings in the world. And so they decide to do something unique. They give themselves the authority to start a government. It's called the Mayflower Compact. It says, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith a voyage to plant the first colony on the northern parts of Virginia, we in the presence of God covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic to enact just and equal laws and so forth. So it was a polarity change in government, instead of top-down, ruled by kings. It's bottom-up, ruled by the people. Dr. Joe mentioned this. It's the difference between a dead pyramid and a living tree where every root contributes and sucks in nutrients. Every citizen participates. They got this from their congregational form of church government. Their pastor, John Robinson, was not an Anglican king-appointed pastor. He was a Congregationalist-type pastor. So they basically took their church government and they made it their community government. And that influenced the rest of New England. And anyway, so I'm going to skip past some stuff for the sake of time. And the pilgrims get over here, and they do a good job. And half of them die the first winter. I don't know if you've ever been to Plymouth Rock area. They buried them in an unmarked grave because they didn't want the Indians to see how many of them died and know how weak they were. And no one knew where the grave was. But maybe probably a century ago now, there was like a big storm, hurricane almost, and it washes away a hillside, and then they see all these bones sticking out. So they gathered up the bones, and now on top of this hill, they have a big sort of marble tomb for them. But so only half survived till the spring. And then in the spring, an Indian comes boldly among them. This is William Bradford writing, and spoke to them in broken English, and his name was Samoset. And he told them of another Indian whose name was Squanto, who had been in England and could speak English better than himself. Lo and behold, you had Spain controlled all the New World, so the other ones were hesitant to start colonies, but they would come over, and they would pirate the Spanish ships, and then they would also fish up and down the coast, and then unscrupulous ones would lure Indians on the boat and take them back to Europe as slaves. And so evidently Squanto was taken back to England and was taught English, and he worked with some of the companies that did shipping. And so William Bradford says that a few days later arrived Squanto with the chief Massasoit, and then after the chief, his friends, other attendants were with Squanto, and they gave him some gifts. And it says that they did a peace treaty that lasted 24 years. Squanto stayed with them as an interpreter and was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. There they are smoking the peace pipe. So what happened? So trying to piece together the history of Squanto. Around 1605, it appears he was kidnapped with other Patu ex-natives and taken to London. There he served as an interpreter, and in 1614, Sir Ferdinando's expedition to map the new coast, that's when he came back. But then another captain named Thomas Hunt shows up. And Squanto's, there's an English ship. He goes, I got this, guys. I can speak English. I know these. He goes there, and lo and behold, this Thomas Hunt arrests him and makes him a slave. And this guy is so unscrupulous, he takes these natives down to Malaga, Spain, and to sell them into slavery. So the Muslims controlled Spain for 700 years, and they had slavery. They enslaved over 1 million Europeans. But even the Spanish drove them out. They kept the slave markets going. And so the story is that Squanto was purchased by some monks and given his freedom, and he finds his way back to England. And then he goes back with a ship to Newfoundland, and then finally gets dropped off at his hometown, his homeland, only to find out that everybody's dead. A plague had wiped out all the Indians of his entire tribe. So he goes and lives with the neighboring Wampanoag tribe. And so William Bradford writes that about 3 years before this, a French ship was shipwrecked off the coast of Cape Cod. And he says that the sailors got ashore and saved some of their provisions, but the Indians surrounded them and never left, watching them and dogging them till they got the advantage and killed them all but 3 or 4 whom they kept and made sport with them, using them worse than slaves. Well, evidently, one of them must have had some illness, and the Indians had no resistance, and it wiped out the entire tribe. So now, a couple years later, is when Squanto's finally dropped back off to find everybody's dead, and he's living with the Wampanoags. But then the Pilgrims land. And instead of going to Jamestown, they were blown off course, and they landed at this one spot on the eastern seaboard where effectively it was not claimed by any Indian tribe. The other tribes refused to go onto that land. They thought some great spirit had gotten rid of everybody. And so this was sort of like an unpopular, so the Pilgrims just sort of providentially land there. And so when Squanto comes out of the woods, you can imagine the dismay on the Pilgrims' face. I mean, half of them died the first winter. They probably would not have survived a second winter. And Squanto walks out of the woods and he goes, "Oh, yeah, you guys from London? Yeah, I used to live there." Yeah. Oh, yeah, the Wharf Street and St. Paul's Cathedral. Yeah, I know. Right. Yeah, and then, I mean, imagine that. And then he says, oh, here? Yeah, I grew up here. I know this area like the back of my hand. There's a spring over there. And it says that Squanto taught him how to plant corn. They said, oh, we tried that. He goes, no, you got to take a fish, put the fish over the kernel of corn, bury it, then guard it for 2 weeks to keep the wolves away. And then it'll fertilize the soil and grow. And then he taught him how to take the corn and put it in a pot and shake it over a fire and make popcorn that came from the American Indians. And then he taught them how to go down to the riverbank and squeegee in the mud and catch eels. And they would eat the eels. And then they would catch clams. And they said, well, we tried fish. And he goes, no, they're salmon. They spawn. And he says, April, I can tell from the moon. It's coming up. You better get your nets ready. You're just going to harvest baskets of fish. And so then he says he guided them to unknown places and never left them till he died. And they got the manure to manure the soil. He showed them in the middle of April there'll be plenty of fish to come up the brook. And then it says, William Bradford says that none of them had ever seen a beaver skin till they were instructed by Squanto. And it took 40 years worth of beaver skins to pay off the boat ride. We always think pilgrims are on a boat. We never ask ourselves, who's paying for all this? They borrowed the money. They promised the investors, they were called adventurers, that they would pay them back, but they really didn't know how they were going to do it, but they paid them back with beaver skins. And so Squanto puts them on good terms with the other tribes. It's not like Jamestown where they have a bunch of Indian fighting. And so the first Thanksgiving, the Indians show up with their deer and turkey, and the Pilgrims have their puddings and their cranberry sauce. And at the end of the day, the Indians just roll up in their blankets on the ground and wake up the next day, and it goes on for a second day. And the boys are doing foot races and arm wrestling and so forth. And then at the end of the day, they roll up in their blankets and they wake up the next day. The first Thanksgiving went on for 3 days. And now Thanksgiving. Now remember, the Pilgrims came from where? Leiden, Holland, where there was an annual day of Thanksgiving for driving the Spanish out after the Spanish Furies, where they killed a lot. And in Leiden, the Jews had their annual Thanksgiving of Rosh Hashanah. And so there is a good indication that the Pilgrims, well, we need to have a day of Thanksgiving. And so William Bradford says that Squanto was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. You know, there's the Bible story of Joseph, and his brothers sold him into slavery. And it says, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. So here's Squanto. His whole life, he just wants to get back home, finds that everybody's dead, feels depressed, living with another tribe, and then the Pilgrims land right on his spot. And he speaks to them in perfect English, knows their cultures, lived in England for probably a dozen years, but he knows this area. Puts them on their interpreter puts them on good terms, teaches them how to plant the food and crops. And, sometimes you in your life may go through crises and problems and painful situations. And a whole lot of your dreams may have been dashed. And you feel like, oh, man, what's my life about? And you're living with the Wampanoags. And you're like, oh. But then there's people with needs. And they show up. And you are equipped to minister to them in a way that nobody else can, because you've been through those crises and those painful times. The Apostle Paul says that comfort one another with the comfort wherewith ye have been comforted. So the same way that the Holy Spirit and his word has pulled you through the crises, you're able to minister to the other people. And so just like Joseph, right? It was an evil thing that his brothers sold him, but then he ended up being promoted to the right hand to the Pharaoh, and God used him to save the Israelites. Squanto, sort of the same way. And all these crises and us being a slave, but he was just specifically, his experiences prepared him to minister and save the Pilgrims. Anyway, another verse, Romans, all things work together for the good of them that love God and are called according to his purpose. And so what happened to Squanto? Well, a year or so later, the Cape Cod, the Pilgrims were exploring, and the Governor Bradford was there, and they had Squanto, and they were on the boat. And he says they couldn't get around the shoals of Cape Cod. What's that? That's the sandbars that are out there. And so they're having to go out deeper and deeper to get around the shoals and the flats and the breakers. And so it starts pouring down freezing rain. And so they put into Manamoick Bay. And William Bradford says, here Squanto fell ill of Indian fever, bleeding much at the nose, which the Indians take for a symptom of death. And within a few days he died. He begged the governor to pray for him that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven, and bequeathed several of his things to his English friends as remembrances. His death was a great loss. But he begged the governor to pray for him that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven. Well, the Englishman's God, they were Christian, and these pilgrims were Christian. I mean, they were like really serious about their faith. They were living it in front of Squanto, and his last words were, I want to go to your God. And I believe they prayed for him, the prayer of salvation, and he trusted in Jesus. And anyway, just an amazing story. Now, I don't know how I'm doing time-wise. 10 minutes, okay. So one other lesson that we can learn from the Pilgrims is private property. So all of the New World was called Virginia. And the Pilgrims were going to go to Jamestown. They landed in Massachusetts. Well, back in England, instead of saying, okay, tell those Pilgrims to uproot and go there, they're like, no. Let's just make a second settlement. And so they cut all the New World in half. And the bottom half is called Virginia. The top half is called Massachusetts, named after an Indian tribe. And so the investors, called adventurers, quickly pieced together a company. And they're like, okay, let's send over some bylaws and let's make this thing profitable instead of going to Jamestown because it's sort of bankrupt. And so the bylaws, you can tell, business guys wrote this because it's like, real neat and clean. It says, all profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means shall remain in ye common stock. So everything you do, you're working hard and you're growing stuff and you're trading and you're fishing, everything goes in ye common stock. And then it says that everybody would be paid out of ye common stock for the course of 7 years. And the problem was nobody was really motivated to do anything. I work really hard. This other guy's sort of lazy, and it all goes into the common stock, and he gets the same percentage out of the common stock. So William Bradford says the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato. What's Plato? Well, back in 380 BC, Plato writes his Republic. And he says a democracy where the people rule won't last because you have a spectrum of power, total government on one side, no government on the other side. Total government, you have a king who rules through fear. No government would be chaos unless the people have virtue and morals. Now, in ancient Israel's case, they had a big magnet in the sky called God, who's watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. But Athens didn't have that. It just had be virtuous for virtuous' sake. For the community's welfare, let's be virtuous. And Plato says this is not going to work, because if you give someone a choice between giving up their virtue or giving up their life, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. He said if anybody really had virtue, they'd have to die to prove that they had virtue, because they would refuse to give it up. He says if somebody was born who really had virtue, the world would be so convicted they would scourge him and crucify him. Plato wrote this in 380 BC. Anyway, so he says the best you can hope for is a nice king. He called him a philosopher king. And how's this king going to stay in power? He's going to take the children away from the parents. He's going to indoctrinate them with noble lives. And then he says, then everything will be owned in common. And so every communist revolution goes back to Plato. And the dictator says, I'm the philosopher king, and everything's owned in common, and I'm in charge. And so here's William Bradford referring to that. He says, emptiness of the theory of Plato, that the taking away of private property and the possession of it in community by a commonwealth would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. It says that this community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit and comfort. For the young men who were most able and fit for service objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the weak man who was not able to do a quarter the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc. with the humbler and younger ones thought it some indignity and disrespect to them. As for men's wives, who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it. Right? I'm not going to have you wash the other guy's clothes. It says, if all were to do alike, then all were in equality throughout, and one was as good as another. And so it did greatly diminish the mutual respect that is so important should be preserved among them. Our founders wanted equality before the law and equality in opportunity, not equality in possessions, right? So the idea is that you don't, you reward people who, the scripture says you reward people who work hard and so forth. And it says, let this not be cause to human failing rather than to this communistic plan of life itself. I answer, seeing that all men have this failing in them, that God in his wisdom saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn and obtain a better crop that they might have done, so that they might not continue to endure the misery of want, right, because they didn't have enough food. At length, after much debate, the governor, with the advice of the chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household and to trust themselves for that in all of the things to go on in the general way as before. So every family was assigned a parcel of land according to the proportion of their number. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means the governor could have devised, and saved him a great deal of trouble and gave far better satisfaction. The field, it says, the women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great tyranny and oppression. Right? And so they experimented with this communism and it didn't work. Another interesting thing, Edward Winslow was one of the young guys that joined up with the Pilgrims, and he comes across. He's later the guys that goes back and forth to England and buys cows and brings them back. There was the chief Massasoit, who's like the real important chief of that area, and he's sick. And so Edward Winslow goes and doctors him up. So here's Winslow's visit to Massasoit. And there he is helping him to get better. And Massasoit recovers. And this contributes to this first generation of peace between the Pilgrims and the Indians. Now, the fine print was, if you doctor a chief and he dies, you die too. So it's pretty serious if you're going to take it upon yourself to doctor the chief. And anyway, and then another thing. So these Pilgrims are saving up beaver skins to send back to England to pay off the adventurers, the investors. And one of them gets captured by the Muslims. And so William Bradford says that they had 2 fishing ships and a pinnace, which is a small ship, and it was ordered with core fish or salted fish to bring to England. And besides, she had some 300 pounds of beaver. And so this ship is going back to England. And they went along and together, and it was such a fine weather that he never cast off the small ship that they were dragging behind till they were well within the English Channel, almost within sight of Plymouth. But there she was unhappily taken by a Turkish man of war and carried off to Salar, Morocco, where the captain and the crew were made slaves. One of the Pilgrim ships was captured by the Muslim pirates and taken to Morocco. And it says, thus all their hopes were dashed, and the joyful news they meant to carry home turned to heavy tidings. And it says that the adventurers were so reduced by their losses last year and now by the ship taken by the Turks that all trade was dead. So imagine how long it takes to save up 800 pounds of beaver skins. And they pack this ship full of all this stuff, and they're like, okay, now we want some iron, I want some thread for my this, I want some, a plow, I want a cow. I mean, they're like giving them a whole list of things they want. And the guys, come back later and say, sorry, nothing, because the Muslims took our ship, and all trade was dead. So anyway. And then the last little thought, I did a whole book on the history of Christmas. Do I have time? So on the back there of the book is There Really is a Santa Claus. Maybe if you want me to come back before Christmas, I'll share this story. So I give the whole history of Santa Claus. The Puritans, remember the Puritans, right? So England was Anglican, and then first it was Catholic, then it was Anglican, and then the Puritans wanted to purify the Anglican Church. The Puritans were pretty strict. They did not want to celebrate Christmas. Why? Because during Henry VIII's time, Christmas became sort of a Mardi Gras. Drinking, carousing. Mardi Gras was the day before Lent, when you would fast 40 days before Easter. And so it originally had a spiritual meaning, Mardi Gras. Now it's this lewd party in New Orleans. That's sort of what happened with Christmas in England with Henry VIII. It was wassailing, where you get drunk on some booze and then you throw some of it on a plant for have a nice harvest the next year, and carousing and so forth. And so the Puritans outlawed Christmas in England in 1640 to 1660, about 20 years. The Pilgrims actually forbade Shakespeare from using God's name in the plays. That's when Shakespeare began to do Midsummer Night's Dream and have these fairies and stuff like this, because the Puritans wouldn't let him mention the name of God. The Puritans actually tore down Shakespeare's Globe Theater, and it was not rebuilt until like 1980. And anyway, so the Puritans, and then the Pilgrims are sort of on the same vein. So Captain of the Mayflower, Christopher Jones, writes December 25th. He says, at anchor in Plymouth Harbor, Christmas Day, but not observed by these colonists, they being opposed to all saints' days, etc. A large party went ashore this morning to fell timber, erect their first house. And William Bradford says, one more incident, rather amusing. On Christmas Day, the governor called the people out to work as usual. But most of the new company that came on a second ship excused themselves and said it was against their conscience to work on that day. So the governor told them if they made it a matter of conscience, because those pilgrims are into conscience, right? Unless you feel, he would spare them till they were better informed. So he went with the rest and left them, but on returning at work at noon, he found them at play in the street, some pitching the bar, some at stool ball, some in like sports. So he went to them and took away their games and told them that it was against his conscience that they should play and others work. And if they made it keeping the day a matter of devotion, let them remain in their houses, but there should be no gaming and reveling in the streets. So anyway, the Dutch settled New Amsterdam, which became New York, and they did love the Christmas traditions. And so the word Santa Claus is Dutch for Sant Nicolaas. Right, Saint Nicholas, Sant Nicolaas, and fascinating history, but I can share that later. So I'll turn it back over to Dr. Joe. Did you enjoy this?
Excellent. I was going to tell you, I know we have to go. It's a little after 10:30, but if you want to write questions down, that sounds like a great idea. You heard him say it. Mr. Federer said he would come back and see us before Christmas, so I will absolutely ask him back. But if you want to write questions down, maybe he could do the first half of his next talk in handling questions, comments, things of this nature. I'm sure you have them. But visit the book table on the way out, and we'll see you guys over at the main service. Thank you, guys.